The night was silent, too silent. A thick fog rolled across the fields of France as German scouts peered through binoculars, frozen in disbelief. Below them, an entire American armored division had appeared out of nowhere. Hundreds of tanks, troops, artillery, the unmistakable sound of engines rumbling, radios buzzing with encrypted chatter. A full invasion force preparing to attack. But there was one problem. None of it was real. The German commander issued the alert. American forces have reinforced the sector. Repeat, thousands of troops have arrived. We must prepare a counteroffensive. Within hours, Nazi high command diverted 40,000 soldiers to stop this new threat. But what they were rushing toward was not an army of men. It was an army of illusions. Rubber tanks that weighed less than a bicycle. Speakers blasting fake engine noises recorded in Hollywood. Artists, designers, and fashion students, dressed in uniform, pretending to be soldiers. This was the Ghost Army, a top-secret unit so classified, its very existence was buried for more than 50 years. They didn't fight with bullets. They fought with deception. Their mission, to make the enemy believe in a reality that did not exist. And tonight, you're going to discover how a group of artists and illusionists changed the course of World War II, using nothing but rubber, paint, and sound. This is not just a story of war. This is the story of how reality itself can be weaponized, and how the greatest battles in history may not have been won with force, but with imagination. Before the Ghost Army ever set foot on the battlefield, it began as a whisper in the halls of power. It was 1943. The Allies were winning battles, but losing men faster than they could be replaced. Every inch of ground in Europe was paid for in blood. The German war machine was brutal, methodical, and every time the Allies massed troops for a real attack, the Germans saw it coming. The U.S. needed a way to be everywhere, even when they were nowhere. Behind closed doors, in a dimly lit office in Washington, D.C., a concept emerged. What if we could create an army that doesn't exist? Not an army to fight, but an army to be seen fighting. One man, Colonel Billy Harris of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, proposed a radical idea. Instead of sending more men to die on the front lines, they would send illusions. Harris believed that war was not just a contest of strength. It was a contest of perception. Whoever controlled what the enemy believed controlled the battlefield. The concept was quietly sent to the highest levels. General Dwight D. Eisenhower himself reviewed the proposal, and instead of dismissing it as madness, he approved it. But to build an army of ghosts, they would not recruit traditional soldiers. They would search far outside the military. They began visiting art schools, fashion institutes, Hollywood sound stages. Young men who had never held a rifle were now being drafted, not because they could kill, but because they could create illusions. One of the recruits, fashion designer Bill Blass, later wrote in his diary, "We were artists, sent to fight a war of the mind." And so, in total secrecy, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was born. Its mission would be hidden from the world. Its actions would remain classified for decades. Their task was simple: make the enemy see what isn't there, and hide what is. And if they failed, tens of thousands of Allied soldiers would be slaughtered in real battles that could have been avoided. The Ghost Army had one rule: you do not exist. You were never here. No one can ever know what you have done. What does it take to build an army that doesn't exist? Not weapons, not tanks, not bullets. You need something far more powerful: belief. At a secret manufacturing site in New Jersey, A convoy of unmarked trucks arrived carrying boxes that at first glance made no sense. Inside were no shells, no rifles, no ammunition. Instead, there were rubber sheets, paint cans, air compressors, wooden poles, phonograph machines, and miles of wire. These were the tools that would be used to forge illusions so convincing that even trained enemy scouts would be fooled. One soldier described unpacking an inflatable M4 Sherman tank. It took 4 of us to carry it, not because it was heavy, but because the wind almost blew it away. But within 20 minutes, that same rubber shell stood full size, looming nearly 9 feet tall, casting a shadow across the field. From the air, from binocular distance, even from just a few hundred yards, it was indistinguishable from the real thing. And the tanks were just the beginning, the 4 pillars of illusion. The Ghost Army built an elaborate system of deception, divided into 4 secret units. Visual Deception Unit, inflatable tanks, trucks, planes, and artillery, painted to match mud wear battle damage. Sonic Warfare Unit, giant speakers mounted on half-tracks, blasting pre-recorded sounds of armored divisions moving, tanks clanking, troops shouting orders, heard from 20 miles away. Radio Deception Unit, expert signal operators who mimicked entire battalions' radio traffic, complete with fake accents, military codes, and scripted chatter. Special effects and atmospherics, soldiers posing as generals, setting up fake command posts, hanging laundry, even driving jeeps back and forth to simulate large troop movements. Every illusion had to be perfect, because if even one German scout saw through it, the entire operation and thousands of real soldiers would be put at risk. One officer later said, "We weren't creating props, we were creating reality." As the first inflatables were tested in fields across England, an eerie sight emerged. Rubber tanks rolled silently into position. Fake artillery glistened in the morning sun. Speakers began to roar with the sound of war. And for the first time, the Ghost Army was ready to step onto the battlefield. But what they didn't know was that their first mission would be a matter of life and death for thousands of Allied soldiers, preparing for the most important invasion in human history. July 1944. The real Allied forces were advancing through France, but every step forward came with a cost. German forces were regrouping, preparing fierce counterattacks. If the enemy discovered the true locations of Allied divisions, disaster would follow. And so, for the first time, the Ghost Army entered active combat zones. They arrived not with guns, but with inflatable tanks strapped to their backs, not with artillery, but with speakers the size of trucks. One soldier wrote in his diary, "We were walking into a war with nothing but air and paint to protect us. Operation Brest, the first blood." In late August, the Ghost Army staged their first major field deception near the city of Brest. The Germans believed an American armored division had arrived to reinforce the sector. In reality, there were fewer than 1,100 Ghost Army soldiers, pretending to be over 30,000 men. They set up hundreds of inflatable tanks, created fake artillery positions, broadcast the sounds of convoys moving through the night, and even drove jeeps in endless loops to simulate battalion traffic. German reconnaissance planes flew overhead. Scouts reported seeing heavily fortified American forces. The deception worked. The Germans repositioned their real forces, pulling troops from areas where the actual Allied soldiers were preparing to strike. But success came at a price. As the Ghost Army moved closer to the front lines, they could no longer hide behind distance. They were within range of enemy artillery. One night, a shell landed just meters from their inflatable tanks. The soldiers watched in silence as shrapnel ripped through rubber and canvas, exposing the truth beneath the illusion. Yet the Germans never saw it. In the darkness, in the chaos of war, even a destroyed inflatable tank looked like a damaged real one. Still, the danger was real. The Ghost Army had no heavy weapons. If they were discovered, they would be slaughtered. As one operator later said, "We weren't just deceiving the Germans, we were daring them to kill us, and their greatest challenge was still ahead, a mission that would put them directly in the path of a German counteroffensive, alone, outnumbered, and completely exposed." March 1945. The Rhine River stood as Nazi Germany's last major line of defense. Crossing it would open the path to Berlin and end the war. The Allies were preparing their real crossing point, but if the Germans concentrated their forces there, it would be a massacre. So, one final, extraordinary illusion was put into motion. The Ghost Army was assigned its most critical mission yet: convince the Germans that the main crossing would occur miles away from the real target. They had 10 days to stage the largest deception in modern warfare, and they did it using nothing but air, sound, and belief. The setup. On an empty field near Viersen, Germany, Ghost Army soldiers sprang into action. 600 inflatable tanks and artillery units were positioned in broad daylight, as if daring German scouts to see them. Miles of camouflage netting were hung to suggest hidden weapon stockpiles. Fake command posts buzzed with scripted radio transmissions. Troops in disguise posed as officers, moving secret orders between tents. At night, massive speakers played the sounds of tanks rolling across pontoon bridges, engines revving, chains clanking. Every sense was targeted: sight, sound, signal, and human intelligence, to sell one single lie. The U.S. Ninth Army is preparing to cross the Rhine, right here. A German POW later revealed, "We believed there were 2 full divisions there. We were certain they were preparing an assault." The trap is set. German forces reacted exactly as planned. They rushed their reserves to Viersen, abandoning the true crossing site. As a result, the real Allied forces, miles away, crossed the Rhine with minimal resistance. Historians say this deception may have saved 30,000 lives in a single night. And yet, the men behind this victory were not honored, not recognized, not even acknowledged. They vanished at dawn, leaving only deflated rubber tanks and footprints in the mud. One Ghost Army soldier later said, "We watched real soldiers cross the river to fight and die, and we stood there, in silence, knowing the only weapon we ever fired was a lie." Operation Viersen was hailed by senior officers as a masterpiece of tactical deception. But to the world, it never happened, because the Ghost Army did not exist. May 1945. The guns fell silent across Europe. Nazi Germany surrendered. Cities once filled with the roar of artillery now echoed only with the sound of the wind. For millions, the war was over. For the Ghost Army, it was as if it had never happened at all. Mission complete. Existence erased. The men of the Ghost Army were called into a final briefing. There were no medals, no public honors, no mention in newspapers or documentaries. Instead, they were told, "Everything you have done is classified. You are never to speak of it. You were never here." One soldier remembered that moment, saying, "I went home to my family and they asked me, 'What did you do in the war?' I had to look them in the eye and say, 'Nothing. I wasn't there.'" These men returned to ordinary lives. Bill Blass went on to become a world-famous fashion designer. Ellsworth Kelly became one of the most influential artists of the 20th century. Art Kane became a legendary photographer. They hung their uniforms in silence. They carried the weight of their secret, not as soldiers seeking glory, but as artists who had saved lives with illusions, a legacy hidden in shadows. While other war units were celebrated and remembered, the Ghost Army vanished from history. Not a single textbook mentioned them. Their families never knew the truth. Their stories went untold. Their sacrifices unrecognized. And yet military historians would later say, the Ghost Army may have been the most influential unit of the entire war, precisely because no one knew they existed. For decades, their files remained locked away, stamped top secret. The world moved on, but the echoes of their illusions still haunted the battlefield. For 50 years, the world never knew the Ghost Army existed. Their files remained hidden, their missions erased, their heroism buried under government seals marked classified. But history has a way of demanding to be heard. 1996, the truth emerges. In a quiet archive room in Washington, D.C., military historian Rick Beyer unearthed documents that defied logic. Reports of entire divisions that didn't exist. Maps showing fake troop positions that changed the course of battles. Records of artists and illusionists listed as combat personnel. The truth began to surface. Slowly, the story of the Ghost Army re-emerged. Veterans, now old men, were finally allowed to speak. One of them broke down in an interview. We never fired a bullet, but we saved thousands of lives. I've carried that in silence my entire life. 2022, official recognition. Nearly 80 years after their secret missions, the United States Congress finally recognized the Ghost Army with the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the nation's highest honors. As the medal was awarded, the speaker said, "Their weapons were decoys, their ammunition was illusion, and their courage was real. These men changed warfare forever, not with power but with perception, not with destruction but with deception, a legacy that still echoes today. Their tactics have shaped every conflict since. Operation Desert Storm used inflatable tanks to confuse Iraqi forces. Modern military units use electronic deception to create ghost signals. Even in today's cyber wars, what you see may not be what's real." The Ghost Army taught the world one undeniable truth. In war, reality is not defined by what exists, but by what the enemy believes exists. Closing statement. They were painters, designers, sound engineers, young men who once dreamed of art, and found themselves creating illusions in the shadows of history. They didn't fight with bullets. They fought with imagination. Their story remained hidden for half a century, but today, their ghosts return. Not to deceive, but to remind us that the greatest battles in history are not won on the battlefield. They are won in the mind. This was the Ghost Army, and now you know their truth. Subscribe for more hidden war stories that were never meant to see the light of day.